a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Red states and blue states. Since the 2000 United States presidential election, red states and blue states have referred to states of the United States whose voters predominantly choose either the Republican Party or Democratic Party presidential candidates. Since then, the use of the term has been expanded to differentiate between states being perceived as liberal and those perceived as conservative. Examining patterns within states reveals that the reversal has happened at the state level, but is more complicated locally, with urban/rural divides associated with many of the largest changes. All states contain both liberal and conservative voters and only appear blue/red on the electoral map, because of the winner-take-all system used by most states in the Electoral College. However, the perception of some states as blue, and some as red, was reinforced by a degree of partisan stability from election to election. From the 2000 election to the 2004 election, only 3 states changed color. And as of 2016, fully 38 out of 50 states have voted for the same party in every presidential election since the red/blue terminology was popularized in 2000. The choice of colors reverses a long-standing convention of political colors whereby red symbols are associated with left-wing politics, and right-wing movements often choose blue as a contrasting color. Indeed, until the 1980s, Democrats were often represented by red and Republicans by blue. The current terminology of red states and blue states came into use in the United States presidential election of 2000 on an episode of The Today Show on October 30, 2000, wanting to avoid any implied connection between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. According to the Washington Post, the terms were coined by journalist Tim Russert during his televised coverage of the 2000 presidential election. That was not the first election during which the news media used colored maps to depict voter preferences in the various states, but it was the first time a standard color scheme took hold. The colors were often reversed or different colors used before the 2000 election. Origins of the color scheme. Before the 2000 presidential election, the traditional color coding scheme was often blue for Republican, red for Democrat, in line with European associations, where red is used for left-leaning parties, and blue for the right. The colors red and blue also are featured on the US flag. Traditional political mapmakers, at least throughout the 20th century, have used blue to represent the modern-day Republicans, as well as the earlier Federalist Party. This may have been a holdover from the American Civil War, during which the predominantly Republican North was considered blue. However, at that time, a maker of widely sold maps accompanied them with blue pencils in order to mark Confederate force movements, while red was for the Union. Even earlier, in the 1888 presidential election, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison used maps that coded blue for the Republicans, the color perceived to represent the Union and Lincoln's party, and red for the Democrats. The parties themselves had no official colors, with candidates variously using either or both of the national color palette of red and blue. There was one historical use, associated with Boss rule, of blue for Democrats and red for Republicans. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Texas county election boards used color coding to help Spanish speakers and illiterates identify the parties. However, this system was not applied consistently in Texas and was not replicated in any other state. In 1908, the New York Times printed a special color map, using blue for Democrats and yellow for Republicans, to detail Theodore Roosevelt's 1904 electoral victory. That same year, a color supplement included with the July issue of the Washington Post used red for Republican-leaning states, blue for Democratic-leaning states, yellow for doubtful states, and green for territories which had no presidential vote. Contemporary use. The advent of color television prompted television news reporters to rely on color-coded electoral maps, though sources conflict as to the conventions they followed. One source claims that in the 6 elections prior to 2000 every Democrat but one had been coded red. It further claims that from 1976 to 2004, the broadcast networks, in an attempt to avoid favoritism in color coding, standardized on the convention of alternating every 4 years between blue and red, the color used for the incumbent party. According to another source, in 1976, John Chancellor, the anchorman for NBC Nightly News, asked his network's engineers to construct a large illuminated map of the United States. The map was placed in the network's election night news studio. If Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate that year, won a state, it would light up in red. If Gerald Ford, the incumbent Republican president, carried a state, it would light up in blue. The feature proved to be so popular that, 4 years later, all 3 major television networks would use colors to designate the states won by the presidential candidates on election night, though not all using the same color scheme. NBC continued to use the color scheme employed in 1976 for several years. NBC newsman David Brinkley famously referred to the 1980 election map outcome showing Republican Ronald Reagan's 44-state landslide as resembling a suburban swimming pool. CBS, from the 1984 election on, used the opposite scheme, blue for Democrats, red for Republicans. ABC used yellow for Republicans and blue for Democrats in 1976. However, in 1980 and 1984, ABC used red for Republicans and blue for Democrats. In 1980, when independent John B. Anderson ran a relatively high-profile campaign as an independent candidate, at least one network provisionally indicated that they would use yellow if he were to win a state. Similarly, in 1992 and 1996, at least one network would have used yellow to indicate a state won by Ross Perot. Neither of them did claim any states in any of these years. By 1996, color schemes were relatively mixed, as CNN, CBS, ABC, and the New York Times referred to Democratic states with the color blue and Republican ones as red, while Time and the Washington Post used an opposite scheme. NBC used the color blue for the incumbent party, which is why the Democrats were represented by blue in 2000. In the days following the 2000 election, whose outcome was unclear for some time after Election Day, major media outlets began conforming to the same color scheme, because the electoral map was continually in view, and conformity made for easy and instant viewer comprehension. On election night that year, there was no coordinated effort to code Democratic states blue and Republican states red. The association gradually emerged, partly as a result of this eventual and near-universal color coding. The terms red states and blue states entered popular use in the weeks following the 2000 presidential election. After the results were final, journalists stuck with the color scheme. As The Atlantic's December 2001 cover story by David Brooks entitled, "One Nation, Slightly Divisible," illustrated. Thus, red and blue became fixed in the media and in many people's minds. Despite the fact that no official color choices had been made by the parties, some Republicans argue the GOP should retain its historic link with blue, since most center-right parties worldwide are associated with blue. On March 14, 2014, the California Republican Party officially rejected red and adopted blue as its color. Architsi, the New York Times graphics editor who made the choice when the Times published its first color presidential election map in 2000, provided an on-political rationale, explaining that both Republican and red start with the letter R. Map interpretation. There are several problems in creating and interpreting election maps that should be taken into account. Popular vote data is necessarily aggregated at several levels, such as counties and states, which are then colored to show election results. Maps of this type are called choropleth maps, which have several well-known problems that can result in interpretation bias. One problem arises when aerial units differ in size and significance, as is the case with election maps. These maps give extra visual weight to larger aerial units, whether by county or state. This problem is compounded in that the units are not equally significant. A large county or state in area may have fewer voters than a small one in area. For example, Some maps attempt to account for this by using cartogram methods, but the resulting distortion can make such maps difficult to read. Another problem relates to data classification. Election maps often use a two-class color scheme, which results in a map that is easy to read, but is highly generalized. Some maps use more classes, such as shades of red and blue, to indicate the degree of election victory. These maps provide a more detailed picture, but have various problems associated with classification of data. The cartographer must choose how many classes to use and how to break the data into those classes. While there are various techniques available, the choice is essentially arbitrary. The look of a map can vary significantly depending on the classification choices. The choices of color and shading likewise affect the map's appearance. Further, all election maps are subject to the interpretation error known as the ecological fallacy. Finally, there are problems associated with human perception. Large areas of color appear more saturated than small areas of the same color. A juxtaposition of differing colors and shades can result in contrast misperceptions. For example, due to the simultaneous contrast effect, the Bezold effect, and other factors, an area shaded light red surrounded by areas shaded dark red will appear even lighter. Differing shades of red and blue compound this effect. Cartographers have traditionally limited the number of classes so that it is always clear which class a color shade represents. Some election maps, however, have broken this tradition by simply coloring each areal unit with a red-blue mixture linked to voting ratio data, resulting in an unclassified choropleth map. These purple maps are useful for showing the highly mixed nature of voting, but are extremely difficult to interpret in detail. The lack of clear classes make these purple maps highly prone to the problems of color perception described above. However, there are pros and cons to both classified and unclassified choropleth maps. Each tend to bring out some patterns while obscuring others. All these points should be taken into account when looking at election maps. Critiques. The paradigm has come under criticism on a number of fronts. Many argue that assigning partisanship to states is only really useful as it pertains to the Electoral College, primarily a winner-take-all system of elections. The Democratic and Republican parties within a particular state may have a platform that departs from that of the national party, sometimes leading that state to favor one party in state and local elections, and the other in presidential elections. This is most evident in the southern United States, where the state Democratic Party organizations tend to be more conservative than the national party, especially on social issues. Likewise, Republicans have elected a number of statewide office holders in states that are solidly Democratic at the presidential level, such as New York, Illinois, Hawaii, and Vermont. The United States presidential election in Arkansas, 2004 as well as the one in West Virginia in 2004 were won by Republican George W. Bush, but Democrats at the time held all 4 U.S. Senate seats and a majority of elected executive office holders in those states. Similarly, the United States presidential election in Tennessee, 2004 went to Bush in both 2000 and 2004, but going into 2004, its governor was a Democrat, and both chambers of the state legislature were controlled by Democrats as well. The converse can also be true, as in the case of the United States presidential election in Maine, 2004, which had 2 Republican U.S. senators, but the states were won by Democrat John Kerry. Likewise, Vermont, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Hawaii all voted in wide margins for Democrat Kerry, but all had Republican governors at the time. In his address before the 2004 Democratic National Convention, Barack Obama spoke on the issue of blue states and red states, saying, "The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, red states for Republicans, and blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them, too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states. And we don't like federal agents poking around our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states and have gay friends in the red states. We are one people. All of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes. All of us defending the United States of America. In April 2008, Republican presidential nominee John McCain predicted that the 2008 presidential election would not follow the red state/blue state pattern, saying, "I'm not sure that the old red state, blue state scenario that prevailed for the last several elections works. I think most of these states that we have either red or blue are going to be up for grabs." Arguably, this eventually proved to be somewhat true, but not in McCain's favor, as Obama won 3 red states that had not voted Democratic in many years, namely Virginia, North Carolina, and Indiana. Obama also came close to winning Missouri, losing it by only a 0.2% margin. Notably, however, the only deviations from the pre-existing red-blue paradigm were all in Obama's favor. Purple states. A purple state refers to a swing state where both Democratic and Republican candidates receive strong support without an overwhelming majority of support for either party. Purple states are also often referred to as battleground states. The demographic and political applications of the terms have led to a temptation to presume this arbitrary classification is a clear-cut and fundamental cultural division. Given the general nature and common perception of the two parties, red state implies a conservative region or a more conservative American, and blue state implies a more liberal region or a more liberal American. But the distinction between the two groups of states is less simplistic. The analysis that suggests political, cultural, and demographic differences between the states is more accurate when applied to smaller geographical areas. Traditionally, the practice of designating a U.S. state as red or blue is based on the winner-take-all system employed for presidential elections by 48 of the 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. Despite the prevalent winner-take-all practice, the minority always gets a sizable vote. While the red/blue paradigm encourages hardening into ideological camps, political parties, candidates in those parties, and individuals members of those parties have a variety of positions and outlooks. Nearly every town, city and patch of farmland in the country is purple, a mix of neighbors, friends and family, each of whose own mixed political preferences tip the scale to vote for one side or the other in a contest. Individually and collectively, they are not reducible to red or blue. An emerging area of science that includes network theory, complexity science and big data is changing the way we see and understand complex systems and massive amounts of information by allowing us to see and analyze massive detail. One example is Martin Newman's election results maps, which change from a red/blue paradigm to one of shades of purple. All states were consistent in voting for George W. Bush or his Democratic Party opponent in the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections, except for 3, New Mexico, Iowa, and New Hampshire. The 2004 election showed 2 of these 3 states to be true to the presidential preferences of their respective regions, creating a greater regional separation. Thus, an argument that the country was more divided from the 2000 election. All 3 of those states were very close in both elections. In 2008, Obama carried Iowa and New Hampshire by more than 9 percentage points, and New Mexico by double digits. During the Bush administration, the red-blue map was criticized by some for exaggerating the perceived support for President Bush. In the 2000 election, Bush received a smaller share of the popular vote than Al Gore, and 4 years later defeated John Kerry in this count by less than 2.5 percentage points. However, because of the large geographical size of many states in the central and southern United States, the color-coded map appeared to show a huge tide of support for Bush and the Republicans, with thin outliers of Democratic support on the coasts and near the Great Lakes. In reality, many of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain states which voted for Bush are relatively sparsely populated, while the blue states represented a comparatively small geographic area. They contained large populations. which ended up making President Bush's national level of support slimmer than the red-blue map would seem to indicate. Various different maps, such as ones which coded states based on the strength of their support for one candidate or another, ones which gave results based on county, or ones which displayed states according to the size of their population, were proposed as correctives to this perceived flaw. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?